Ethan Carter shuffled back onto the Carter Auto Group lot, the late afternoon sun glinting off rows of polished hoods, a cruel contrast to the sting of Chad Wheeler's mockery still ringing in his ears. Try Craigslist or a bicycle? Chad had sneered, his voice dripping with contempt as he waved off Mike. A man already beaten down by life, his shoulders slumped under a threadbare jacket. Ethan's cheap polo chafed at his neck, the fabric stiff and unfamiliar, his glasses slipping down his nose as he clung to his Tom Reed disguise. At 56, he'd weathered plenty. Sleazy suppliers try to unload lemons, slow months where payroll hung by a thread, but this cut deeper. His dealership, his life's work, built on the promise of giving folks a fair shake, had turned into something ugly. Mike's humiliation wasn't just one loudmouth salesman's doing. It was a flare, a signal lighting up a rot Ethan hadn't seen coming. He limped toward the showroom, jaw tight, the ache in his bad knee flaring with every step. Chad might be the loudest symptom, but something or someone was feeding this disease. Ethan needed to see the machine at work, to peel back its layers before he could rip it apart. Inside, the showroom gleamed like a showroom should, polished floors reflecting the sharp edges of new cars, the air heavy with the scent of leather and wax. But the shine felt hollow, a veneer stretched thin over something sour. Ethan's first test came quick. Lena Harper, a saleswoman in her late 20s with sharp brown eyes and a cautious smile, approached him, her name tag catching the fluorescent light. "Hi, welcome in," she said, her tone professional but edged with a wariness that didn't match the practiced cheer of her greeting. "Looking for anything particular?" Ethan leaned into his role, letting his voice drop to a gravelly rumble. "Something reliable, not too pricey, maybe used." Lena nodded, guiding him toward a row of sedans, her steps measured. Her glance darted around, quick, subtle, like she was scanning for predators. Then she leaned in, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Heads up, the financing team here pushes some aggressive terms. Read everything before you sign." Ethan's brow lifted, a flicker of surprise cracking his mask. "Aggressive how?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening on the clipboard she held, then murmured, "Hidden fees, high rates. Some folks don't see the trap till it's too late." His stomach tightened. Here was honesty, raw and unexpected, a crack in the polished facade. But it meant his own people were laying traps, preying on the trusting. Before he could dig deeper, a sharp voice sliced through. "Lena, what you doing?" Rick Donovan, the sales manager, strode over, his suit crisp, his glare colder than the showroom's tiled floor. Lena straightened, tension coiling in her frame. "Just helping a customer, Rick." He barely flicked his eyes at Ethan, pinning her instead. "If you got time to chat, you've got time to close. Move it." Lena's jaw clenched, but she shot Ethan an apologetic look and walked off, her steps clipped. Ethan logged it. Pressure, fear, a system designed to squeeze out the good. Rick turned to him, his demeanor flipping like a light switch, smooth, oily, a salesman's grin plastered across his face. "Sorry about that. She's still learning. What can I help you with?" Ethan forced a shrug, keeping it casual. "Just something affordable." Rick's nod was too eager, his eyes glinting with a hunger Ethan recognized from decades in the game. "Plenty of options, and don't worry about price. We'll make the numbers work." Ethan knew that line. The bait dangled before the hook sank in, and it set his teeth on edge. Rick led him to a glass-walled office, a finance officer, Kevin, according to his nameplate, joining them with a stack of papers and a smile as practiced as Rick's. The pitch rolled out fast, a well-rehearsed dance. Low monthly payments waved like a carrot, but Ethan caught the catch. An interest rate so high it'd choke a real buyer, fees buried in fine print like landmines. "Best deal you'll get," Rick purred, leaning in, his cologne sharp in the confined space. Ethan feigned hesitation, testing the waters. "Seems steep. What if I don't qualify?" Kevin smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Oh, you won't, but we've got other options." Ethan's patience frayed. This wasn't a fluke. It was a playbook, a trap sprung on anyone desperate enough to walk through the door. His dealership wasn't just failing customers. It was fleecing them, and the ease of it, the casual confidence, churned his gut. How many had sat in this chair, pen in hand, signing their lives away under this roof? The tension spiked as Ethan played along, letting Rick and Kevin spin their web. Outside, a commotion broke his focus, a woman's voice, sharp with anger, clashing with Chad's smug drawl. "I was promised a fair deal. Now my payments are $200 higher," she snapped, her hands trembling as she faced Chad near a shiny SUV, its price tag still taped to the window. "Ma'am, you signed the paperwork. It's all there," Chad shrugged, his smirk wide enough to see from across the lot. "You rushed me. You didn't explain." Her voice cracked, desperation bleeding through. "Not my problem. If you can't afford it, read next time." Ethan's fists balled in his pockets, the scene a mirror to Mike's earlier humiliation. This wasn't one salesman gone rogue. It was a pattern, a culture spreading like rust through every corner of the lot. Rick glanced over from the office doorway, unfazed, then turned back to Ethan with that same oily grin. "Don't mind that. Happens sometimes. Let's get you squared away." Ethan stood, muttering, "Need a minute," and stepped toward the argument, pulse racing. Chad's arrogance, the woman's despair. It was too much, too familiar, a raw nerve he couldn't ignore. But he held back, forcing himself to breathe. He had to see the full scope of this mess before he could strike. Outside, the air hit him like a slap, cooling the sweat beading on his neck as he caught up to Mike, who'd lingered near the lot's edge, staring at the highway stretching into the distance. Ethan slowed his limp, his voice softening. "Sir, you okay?" Mike turned, his face a map of weariness, deep lines carved around his eyes, a faint tremor in his hand as he rubbed his temple. "It's fine. Should have known dealerships don't bother with guys like me." Ethan shook his head firm. "That's not how it should be." Mike hesitated, then let it spill, his voice low and raw, like a wound reopening. "Lost my wife last year, cancer. Medical bills cleaned me out. Car lasted as long as it could, but now it's dead. I do construction, no ride, no pay." He forced a weak smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "Guess I'll figure out." Ethan's throat closed up, the weight of Mike's words landing like a punch to his chest. This man wasn't just a customer. He was a life teetering on the edge, and Ethan's dealership had kicked him while he was down. "Look," Ethan said, steadying his voice, "let me see what I can do. I know a guy, decent used cars, fair prices, no scams." Mike's eyes narrowed, skepticism flickering. "That's kind, but I don't think it's charity I need." Ethan met his gaze, unflinching. "It's not charity, it's right." Mike studied him for a long beat, then nodded slow. "Name's Mike." Ethan pulled out his phone, saving the number, a lifeline tucked into his pocket. "I'll be in touch, Mike." Ethan turned back to the showroom, the glass doors reflecting a man he barely recognized, stooped, graying, but burning inside with something fierce. Mike's story wasn't just a tragedy. It was a mirror, reflecting everything Carter Auto Group had lost. 30 years ago, Ethan would have helped a guy like Mike himself, rolled up his sleeves, found him a car, worked out a deal that fit, sent him off with a handshake and a nod. Now, his own people laugh men like Mike off the lot, their sneers echoing in Ethan's skull. Lena's warning, hidden fees, high rates, rang in his head, a whisper of truth cutting through a den of lies. Chad's sneer, Rick's polish. It wasn't random chaos. It was orchestrated, a machine Ethan had let grow while he sat 50 miles away in his corner office, signing papers and sipping coffee, blind to the slow rot. His fists tightened as he stepped back inside, the hum of the showroom swelling into a dull roar in his ears. Who was running this show? Rick, Chad, or something bigger? He needed to find a route, and he needed to do it fast. Ethan grabbed a water from a cooler near the entrance, the plastic bottle cold against his palm as he steadied his hands, taking a slow sip. His mind churned like an engine revving too high. Chad still smirking near a pickup, Rick gliding between desks with that predator's grace, Lena's tense shoulders as she moved to another customer. This can't stand, he thought, the bottle creaking as his grip tightened. Who was calling the shots behind this mess? And how deep did it go? He set the water down, his resolve hardening. He'd come here as Tom, to see the truth, but the truth was a beast, sprawling and ugly, and he couldn't unsee it now. Back on the showroom floor, Ethan's chest ached with a quiet dread as he watched the machine churn. Salesmen circled customers like sharks, quick nods, loud laughs, hands guiding folks to desks before they could blink. He drifted toward a row of SUVs, ears sharp, and caught Chad at it again. A woman, mid-30s, frazzled, a single mom by the look of her worn purse and the tired lines around her eyes, stood with Chad, her voice rising. "You said $250 a month. Now it's $450? Chad shrugged, smirking as he tapped a clipboard. "Ma'am, that's the base price. Financing changes things. You signed it." She clutched the contract, her hands shaking. "You rushed me. Said it was the best deal." Chad's laugh was cold, a knife twist of indifference. "Lady, I don't set the rates. Take it or leave it." Ethan's stomach twisted, the echo of Mike's humiliation ringing loud. He glanced at Rick, leaning against a desk nearby, arms crossed, watching with a faint nod. Like this was business as usual, a play he'd scripted. Ethan's blood simmered. This wasn't just greed. It was predation, and Rick was the architect, greenlighting every swipe. The air thickened as Ethan lingered, his limp slowing his pace, his mind racing. 30 years ago, he'd have torn that contract up, set the woman down, found her a deal that worked, something she could manage, something that wouldn't haunt her bank account every month. Now, his own people were sharks, and he'd been too far removed, too trusting to see the culture twist into this. Had he built a legacy just to watch it turn into a mill that ground folks like Mike and this mom into dust? The question clawed at him, a fear he couldn't shake. Had he let Carter Auto become a machine that chewed up the desperate and spat them out broken? He rubbed his temple, the weight of it sinking deep, a dull throb pulsing behind his eyes. Lena's warning, hidden fees, high rates, flashed back, a lifeline of truth, but even she moved stiffly now, her eyes darting to Rick like a deer in a hunter's sights. How many had walked out of here trapped, their trust shattered, their lives upended, while he sat in his office, 50 miles away, oblivious? The tension snapped like a taut wire when Chad's voice boomed again. "Next time, bring cash. Or don't bother," he called after the woman as she stormed toward the exit, tears streaking her face, her purse clutched tight like a shield. Ethan turned, fists balled, ready to drop the act and charge. Then Rick stepped in, clapping Chad on the shoulder with a low chuckle. "Good work. She'll be back when she calms down." They always are. Ethan froze, the twist hitting hard. Rick wasn't just complicit. He was the engine, coaching Chad, defending the hustle like it was a badge of honor. "That's how we do business," Rick added, loud enough for nearby salesmen to smirk, a ripple of agreement spreading through the team. Ethan's breath caught. This wasn't a rogue salesman. It was a culture baked into the walls, and Rick had built it brick by brick. The woman's sobs faded outside, but they echoed in Ethan's skull, a call he couldn't ignore. He'd seen enough to act, but not yet. Not until he knew how to hit hardest, how to dismantle this thing from the core. The breaking point came fast, a moment that tipped the scales. Lena approached a new customer, a retiree with a cane, his voice shaky as he asked about a compact car, something simple to get him to the grocery store and back. She started explaining, her tone calm and clear, laying out the basics, mileage, maintenance costs. But Rick swooped in, cutting her off mid-sentence. "Lena, enough small talk. Close it or move on." She flinched, then murmured to the man, "Just so you know, the rate they'll offer might jump. Check the terms." Rick's face darkened, a storm cloud rolling in, and he pulled her aside, his voice a low growl Ethan could just make out over the showroom buzz. "You warn one more customer, and you're out. No one will hire you after I'm done. Keep your mouth shut." Lena's shoulders slumped, her defiance crumbling under the weight of the threat. Ethan's vision blurred with fury. Lena, the one shred of decency he'd found in this snake pit, crushed under Rick's boot. He felt the room tilt, his cover teetering as he gripped a brochure rack for balance, the metal cool against his sweating palm. This was the blackest moment. His dealership wasn't just failing customers, It was silencing the good, breaking the honest. And he'd let it happen step by step, year by year. Chad's sneers, Rick's threats, the woman's tears. They piled up, a wall he couldn't scale as Tom. Could he save anyone from this mess? Or had he lost it all already? Ethan stepped back, the showroom's hum fading to a dull roar as he retreated to a corner, his limp heavier now, his breath shallow. Lena's defeated nod, Rick's smug stride, Chad's careless laugh. They swirled in his head, a storm he couldn't outrun. He'd built this place to lift people up, folks like Mike, like that mom, like the retiree, and now it was a trap of vice squeezing them dry. His hand shook as he clutched the brochure, its glossy promises, drive the future, mocking him with every word. 30 years of sweat, of handshakes, of late nights balancing books to keep the lights on. Had it all been for this? He glanced at Lena, her eyes downcast as she shuffled papers at a desk. Then at Rick, barking orders like a king on a throne. The route wasn't just deep, it was the foundation, and Ethan felt powerless under its weight. How many more had suffered while he sat in his office, blind and deaf, signing off on doctor reports? Ethan sank onto a bench near the showroom doors, the cold metal biting through his jeans, grounding him as his mind tangled in guilt and resolve. He stared out at the lot, cars gleaming under the setting sun, salesmen circling like vultures, customers walking in with hope and out with regret. I've failed them, he thought, the word the knife twisting in his gut. Chad's smirk, Rick's grip, Lena's fear. It was a chain he had to break, but as Tom, he was just another mark, another fish on the hook. Could he turn this around? Or was it too late to save anyone, even himself? The cold steel of the bench seeped into his bones as Rick's threat to Lena, "You're out if you warn one more customer," echoed in his ears, a final straw snapping something loose inside him. His hands steadied, the fog of despair lifting as a quiet fire sparked in his chest. At 56, he'd faced storms, bank loans denied when he expanded to his second lot, a flood that drowned half his inventory in '98. But this was his fight, his company, and he'd let it slip too long. Chad's sneers, Rick's iron grip, the tears of that single mom. They weren't just failures. They were a call, a chance to reclaim what he'd built. Lena's honesty, Mike's grit. They were the heartbeat of what Carter Auto Group could be, should be, and he wouldn't let them drown. He stood, his limp easing as resolve straightened his spine, a weight shifting off his shoulders. He couldn't fix this as Tom Reed, but as Ethan Carter, he'd tear it down and build it back right. Ethan moved with purpose, shedding the slouch of his disguise as he stepped back into the showroom's hum, the fluorescent lights harsh against his sharpening focus. He'd waited long enough, seen the scams play out, heard the threats, felt the rot sink its teeth in. Now he'd act. He caught Lena's eye as she shuffled papers at a desk, her shoulders still tense, and gave her a slight nod. She frowned, puzzled, her brow creasing, but he turned away, plodding fast. Chad and Rick had to go. That was step one, cut the head off the snake. Lena would step up. She'd earned it with every whispered warning she'd risked. Then he'd call Mike back, make good on his promise, get him behind the wheel of something solid. He slipped into Rick's office, where Kevin still lingered over a stack of contracts, and shut the door with a soft click. Rick looked up from his desk, irritation flashing across his face. "What now, buddy?" Ethan pulled off his glasses, wiped the gray dye from his temples with a sleeve, the rough fabric smearing it into streaks, and met Rick's gaze, unflinching. "I'm Ethan Carter. I own this place." Rick's smirk vanished, his pen dropping with a clatter onto the desk. Kevin sank into his chair, pale, his stack of papers trembling. "I've been undercover," Ethan said, voice steady. "And what I've seen here, it's over." The showdown erupted as Ethan stepped into the fray, his voice cutting through the showroom chatter like a blade. "Chad!" he barked, loud enough to turn heads. Chad spun mid-pitch, smirking at a young couple hovering near a coupe, then froze as Ethan strode over, his limp barely noticeable now. "You humiliated a man today, Mike, mocked him for needing help. Then you scammed a mom into a deal she can't pay. You're fired." Chad's face flushed red, his mouth opening. "You can't I just did. Ethan snapped, turning to Rick, who'd followed from the office, jaw tight, fists clenched at his sides. And you, training this team to lie, pushing traps, threatening Lena? You're out too. Rick bristled, stepping close, his breath hot with defiance. This is how dealerships work. Profit's the game. You think you can just... Ethan cut him off, voice low and lethal, a growl from deep in his chest. Not my dealership. Get your stuff and go. The room hushed, salesman pausing mid-sentence, customers craning necks, the air thick with shock. Rick opened his mouth, then shut it, storming off toward his office as Chad trailed, muttering curses under his breath. Ethan exhaled, the air lighter already, a weight lifting, but he wasn't done. Not by a long shot. He gathered the staff in the center of the showroom, their faces a mix of shock and wariness. Lena near the front, her eyes wide, Kevin shifting nervously in the back, others whispering among themselves. I'm Ethan Carter, your CEO, he began, letting the words hang, letting them sink in. I went undercover to see what's really happening here. What I found: greed, deceit, a culture that's lost its way. That ends today. Gasps rippled through, Lena's hand twitching at her side. Chad and Rick are gone. No more scams. No more pushing bad deals. He turned to Lena, locking eyes with her. You warn me about the tricks, try to do right when no one else would. You're interim sales manager, effective now. Her hand flew to her chest, a shaky me, slipping out, her voice cracking. Ethan nodded, firm. You've got the guts this place needs. Murmurs broke out, some nods, some skepticism, but Ethan pressed on, his voice rising. From now on, we're transparent. Fair prices, clear terms, respect for every customer and every one of you. Anyone who can't handle that can leave. No one moved, the shift palpable, a cautious hope stirring in the silence that followed. The real twist came as Rick lingered by the exit, coat slung over his arm, his polished shoes scuffing the tile. He turned back, voice low and venomous, a parting shot aimed to wound. You think you're some savior? I fudged reports for years, kept complaints off your desk, made your numbers look good. Fire me, and that spills out. Ethan's gut clenched, a flash of doubt piercing his resolve. Had Rick's lies propped up his success, padded his profits while he stayed blissfully ignorant? He squared his shoulders, turning it back on Rick. That's your mess. I'll clean it up. Thanks for the heads up. It's why we're changing. Rick's jaw worked, his eyes narrowing. Then he stalked out, the door slamming behind him with a bang that echoed through the showroom. Ethan faced the team again, his voice firm, unwavering. He hid the truth to save himself. We're done with that. Full transparency, starting now. Lena stepped forward, her resolve hardening, her shoulders squaring, and the room tilted towards something new, something fragile but alive. 3 weeks later, Ethan stood on the lot, the air crisp with early spring, the chaos tamed into a steady rhythm. Lena ran the floor with quiet steel, her badge glinting as she coached a salesman through a fair deal. Explain every line. No shortcuts, she said, her voice calm but unyielding. Customers lingered, chatting over coffee from a new machine Ethan had installed in the waiting area, the grumbling replaced by cautious trust, a slow thaw in the air. Mike had come back. Ethan met him that first day after the purge, hand on a sedan's hood, its paint chipped but its engine solid. This one's yours. Fair price. Financing you can handle, Ethan said, sliding the keys across the hood. Mike's handshake was firm, his never thought I'd get a break, thick with relief, his eyes brighter than they'd been on that first grim day. Ethan overhauled the system. New commission structure rewarding honesty, not hustle. Financing scrubbed clean of traps, every term laid bare. A hotline for complaints, no retaliation, the number posted on every desk. Feedback trickled in. First time I wasn't pressure, they listened, small wins stacking up like bricks in a new foundation. He called Lena one night, the line crackling as he leaned back in his truck, voice warm. Your interim gig's permanent. Her laugh was soft, a rare sound. I'll make it work. He hung up, a rare peace settling in. This was the dealership he'd meant to build, reborn from the ashes of his own neglect. Ethan leaned against his truck in the fading light, The lot buzzing with purpose, salesman guiding, not pushing, customers leaving with smiles, keys in hand. Carter Auto Group breathed again. Trust, fairness, a place for folks like Mike, just as he dreamed 30 years ago when he'd signed the lease on his first tiny lot. But a question lingered, soft and steady, tugging at the edges of his mind. Could he keep this alive across 12 locations, or would greed creep back, silent and insidious? He smiled faintly, the fight still burning in him, a quiet vow to himself. If you believe in fixing what's broken like I do, he thought aloud, his voice low against the hum of the lot, subscribe, hit that like button, and drop a comment. Let's keep this story rolling together.